Hello and welcome to Decisions Training. Today we are going to be covering another Settings.xml topic, the SMTP server. So before we get into how to configure that and what it does, let's give a quick overview of the Settings.xml file. You can find it typically installed in your Drive, Program Files, Decisions, and then under Decisions Server. You should be able to find this XML file and then open it. This will allow you to make changes to the Decisions application. And as a reminder, the Decisions service always needs a restart after you make a change to the Settings.xml in order for that change to take place and be seen in the Decisions environment. So let's go into the SMTP server itself. The configuring of SMTP settings within Decisions allows the Decisions platform to integrate with an outside mail server. This allows Decisions to send mail. So if you're trying to utilize monthly email reports or sending out mail or assignments as emails to particular users, you would need to make sure that these settings are configured. Now, the credentials that you use to configure these will come from your SMTP server. We have a documentation site, which I will link in the description, that shows the settings of particularly common mail server integrations. So you can see how to set this up with those mail servers. This will not cover all SMTP servers, and it will be important that you check your particular SMTP server's documentation to find the right credentials. Now, Decisions will use these credentials that are set in the Settings.xml unless otherwise specified. Such an example where a specification can be made is in the send email step. When you use this, you have the option to configure different SMTP settings that can be mapped in dynamically, or that can be used as a static input that is separate from the Decisions configured SMTP settings. So let me get into those settings and what you'll need to configure, as well as what each of them does. So the first one that you'll want to make sure you have is the server address. This is the address or IP address of the server where the mail server integration is hosted, or perhaps it's a proxy if you're using an outside source. Whatever it may be, this is the address of the server where you can connect Decisions to the SMTP server to make this connection at all. The second thing is the client domain. This is going to be the domain of the SMTP server. This is not necessarily needed for all integrations, even some of the common ones, which you can, again, check the video description to see those settings in our documentation. This can be left blank depending on the SMTP server you are connecting to. The next thing is the port. This is the port across which the communication is made. This will depend, once again, on the SMTP server, whichever port it is listening on. Now, I put port 25 because this is a common protocol to run SMTP servers on port 25 when using HTTP instead of HTTPS, but you will have to check the SMTP server you are connecting to. Or, if you create one yourself, make sure you note the port that it's listening on. Next, we have requires authentication. This will specify whether you need a username and password to authenticate in the environment that you're connecting to. Once again, the necessity of this will depend on the SMTP server and how it authenticates. There is OAuth authentication. This allows for OAuth authentication from the Decisions platform to the SMTP server as a form to authenticate that access. That being said, this OAuth authentication, or specifically the OAuth token ID that will be specified afterward, does not come from the actual data in the token. Rather, this is the Decisions entity ID of the token that you've created in Decisions that is integrating with this external service. So for example, if I integrated with Outlook email, and I needed to have an OAuth authentication with a Microsoft server, you would have to set that up in the Decisions OAuth settings. Then you would pull the ID from that OAuth token created in Decisions and map it here. Next, we have the username and password. If your server requires authentication, this is where you put in that information. the email username, which is typically an email address itself, and the password that allows you to be able to authenticate with this external email service. Next, there's use SSL. SSL, or Secure Sockets Layer, can be toggled to be true or false depending on whether or not the email server is utilizing this setting. If the email is not being transferred over SSL, you don't want SSL set up here. Conversely, if the email is set up to use SSL, you must have that set up here. There's also implicit SSL. Implicit SSL is interesting in that it can be configured to true, false, or null. Decisions by default has this set to null, but you will once again have to check the SMTP server for the proper use of the settings. And then the last one, skip certificate revocation check, is going to determine whether or not you check if the certificate on the SMTP server is true or not. Typically, you want to make sure that you are checking this and ensuring that your connection is more secure, but that is not always the case. Maybe you don't need this on a test server. So those are the basic settings. Let me go over how you would put them in to the decisions Settings.xml. All right, here we are inside of my decisions Settings.xml. So if we want to set up SMTP settings, that is all going to be covered in this little mail section right here. The first thing we want to make sure that we change is bypass SMTP server to false. This will ensure that we are actually using the settings that we're configuring. Otherwise, Decisions is going to try to use something called direct mail. Then we want to make sure that the server address is correct. So if I were trying to connect to Microsoft 365 Office, then I would want to make sure that my server address looks like this. Following this logic, the port that I would want to use would be 587, which is using SSL, which means that we also want to set use SSL to true. Next, we specify the username and password, which will be the username and password for the mailbox we are accessing. So I'll put that in now. And then lastly, if we are authenticating by username and password, we will have to make sure that requires authentication is set to true. If you're trying to use an OAuth token, you will either see this line in here already, or you will have to add it yourself, typically right underneath requires authentication. Here, we are not using OAuth to authenticate, though for Microsoft 365 Office, this is a common option. So you would give this a save, and after that, you restart the decision service, and you should be able to connect to your email. Now, I want to show you something before we conclude this video. It may be a little bit of a hassle to try to continually update the Settings.xml and realize only later that you didn't take the correct parameters from the server that you're trying to integrate with. Rather, it would be better to test this in a flow. So with the send email step, as mentioned earlier, you can use separate SMTP settings. This includes using settings that would send an email even if SMTP is not configured in your Settings.xml. So you can go in here, try the credentials that you need, and if it works when you debug it, you will see it pass, or if it fails, you will know that something needs to be changed. So I highly recommend this method for determining whether or not the SMTP credentials you have are accurate. And that's going to do it for this video. Thank you very much for watching.